The screams echoed through the abandoned barn for exactly 14 hours and 23 minutes. That's what the county records from Rutherford County, North Carolina would later document, though those same records mysteriously vanished from the courthouse archives in 1923. What happened on that October morning in 1841 would become the most disturbing case of revenge in American history. Yet the story was deliberately buried by local authorities who deemed it too horrific for public knowledge. Ruth Coleman was 24 years old when she finally snapped. For 7 years, she had endured unspeakable treatment at the hands of William Crenshaw, a tobacco farmer whose cruelty had become legendary among the enslaved population of Rutherford County. But what Ruth did to her master in those final hours would shock even the hardened men who discovered the scene days later. The truth about what really happened in that barn has been hidden for over a century and 80 years. Before we continue with the story of Ruth Coleman and the revenge that horrified an entire county, make sure you're subscribed to never miss these hidden chapters of American history. Comment below and let us know what state you're listening from, because stories like Ruth's happened in communities just like yours, and their secrets are still buried in courthouse basements and family records across the nation. What we're about to reveal comes from recently discovered personal letters, medical examiner notes, and testimony that was sealed by court order. This is the complete, unfiltered account of how one woman's breaking point led to the most calculated act of vengeance ever recorded in the antebellum South. Rutherford County in 1841 was a place where tobacco ruled everything. The rolling hills of western North Carolina had proven perfect for growing the golden leaf that made men wealthy and others expendable. Small farms dotted the landscape, most worked by enslaved hands who outnumbered their owners 3 to 1 in some areas. It was a powder keg of tension wrapped in the genteel facade of Southern hospitality. The Crenshaw farm sat on a particularly isolated stretch of land, 7 miles from the nearest neighbor. William Crenshaw had inherited the property from his father in 1832. Along with 12 enslaved individuals and a reputation for being what locals euphemistically called a demanding master. But those who knew him understood that William Crenshaw was something far worse than demanding. At 38 years old, Crenshaw was a man consumed by rage and disappointment. His tobacco crops consistently underperformed compared to his neighbors, his attempts at expanding into cotton had failed miserably, and his wife had died in 1837, leaving him alone with his fury and his absolute power over the lives of those he owned. He stood 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of physical labor, hands that bore the calluses of a man who believed in leading by example, and cold gray eyes that seemed to search constantly for reasons to find fault. Ruth Coleman had been born on the Crenshaw property in 1817, the daughter of Sarah Coleman, who worked in the main house. Ruth's childhood had been relatively typical for an enslaved child in North Carolina, filled with small chores, learning skills from her mother, and the gradual understanding of her place in the world. But everything changed when she turned 17 and William's wife died. With no woman to manage the household, Ruth was moved from field work into the main house. She was intelligent, capable, and unfortunately for her, exactly the kind of person that William Crenshaw's twisted mind would fixate upon. Ruth could read, having learned from the Crenshaw children before they were sent away to school. She could manage accounts, organize supplies, and run a household with efficiency that should have been valued. Instead, it became another source of Crenshaw's resentment. The other enslaved individuals on the property had learned to navigate Crenshaw's moods through careful observation and strategic absence. Moses, the oldest among them at 52, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when Crenshaw's anger was building. He would find urgent tasks that took the others far from the main house during these times. But Ruth, working inside, had no such escape. The abuse began gradually, with harsh criticism and impossible standards. Ruth would spend hours polishing silver, only to be told it was tarnished. She would prepare meals exactly as instructed, only to be accused of using too much salt or not enough. The verbal assaults grew meaner, more personal, attacking not just her work, but her intelligence, her appearance, her very existence. But William Crenshaw's cruelty was methodical. He never struck Ruth where marks would be visible to visitors. He never damaged her hands, which he needed functional for her work. Instead, he developed a system of punishment that left her functional but constantly reminded of his power. A kick to her lower back that would leave her aching for days. A twisted arm that would throb whenever she lifted anything heavy. Slaps across her shoulders that stung but left no lasting marks. The psychological torture was even worse. Crenshaw would promise Ruth small freedoms, then snatch them away at the last moment. He would tell her she could visit her mother, then change his mind when she was already walking toward the slave quarters. He would offer her better food, then force her to watch him feed it to his dogs instead. He seemed to study her reactions, learning exactly which hopes to raise and crush for maximum emotional impact. Ruth's mother, Sarah, had died in the winter of 1840, and with her death, Ruth lost her last connection to anything resembling family or comfort. She was alone in the main house with a man whose capacity for cruelty seemed to grow with each passing month. The other enslaved individuals on the property knew what was happening, but they also knew that any attempt to intervene would only make things worse for everyone. By the spring of 1841, Ruth had begun to change. The quick smile that had once characterized her had disappeared entirely. She moved through her daily tasks with mechanical efficiency, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing. She had learned to anticipate Crenshaw's moods, to read the signs that meant a beating was coming, to position herself so that his blows would land on parts of her body that would heal quickly. But something else was happening too. Ruth was learning to hate with a purity and focus that frightened even her. She began to study William Crenshaw the way he had studied her, noting his habits, his weaknesses, his fears. She observed that he was afraid of fire, always nervous around open flames. She noticed that he favored his left leg, limping slightly when he thought no one was watching. She catalogued every cruel word, every blow, every humiliation, storing them away like ammunition for a war she hadn't yet decided to fight. The breaking point came on October 15, 1841, on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday morning. The morning began like countless others, with Ruth rising before dawn to prepare Crenshaw's breakfast and ready his clothes for the day. The tobacco harvest was nearly complete, and Crenshaw had been in a particularly foul mood for weeks. Frustrated by yields that were again lower than expected, he blamed everyone and everything, the weather, the soil, the workers, but most of all he blamed Ruth for existing in his presence as a constant reminder of his failures. Ruth had learned to move quietly through the house, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. She had prepared his usual breakfast of eggs, bacon, and cornbread, arranged exactly as he preferred. The coffee was strong and hot, the way he demanded it. Everything was perfect, which in Ruth's experience often meant that something was about to go very wrong. Crenshaw appeared in the kitchen at exactly 6:30, as was his custom. He was already dressed for field work, his boots mud-stained from checking the tobacco-drying sheds. His grey eyes swept over the breakfast layout, searching for something to criticize. Finding nothing obvious, his attention turned to Ruth herself. "Your hair looks like a bird's nest," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he was looking for an excuse. "Did you even attempt to make yourself presentable this morning?" Ruth kept her eyes down, knowing that meeting his gaze would only escalate his anger. "Yes, sir. I apologize if it's not to your satisfaction." "It's not." He sat down heavily at the table, his chair scraping against the floor. "A man shouldn't have to look at such slovenliness while he eats. Fix it." Ruth moved toward the small mirror hung near the kitchen window, her hands working quickly to smooth her hair into a more acceptable arrangement. Behind her, she could hear Crenshaw eating, the sound of his knife and fork against the plate unusually aggressive. "The eggs are overcooked," he announced after several minutes of silence. Ruth turned back toward him, confusion evident on her face. She had cooked his eggs exactly as she always did, exactly as he had trained her to prepare them. "Sir, I prepared them the same way as always." The plate crashed against the wall 6 inches from Ruth's head, eggs and bacon scattering across the floor, along with fragments of broken ceramic. The sound seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and Ruth felt a warm dampness on her cheek, where a small piece of pottery had grazed her skin. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Crenshaw's voice was deadly quiet now, which was worse than when he shouted. "Are you telling me that I don't know my own preferences?" "No, sir. I'm sorry, sir." Ruth immediately dropped to her knees, beginning to collect the scattered food and broken pieces. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to control them. "Look at this mess. Look what you've made me do." Crenshaw stood up slowly, his boots crunching on pieces of the plate. "You made me waste perfectly good food because you can't follow simple instructions." Ruth knew better than to point out that he had thrown the plate himself. That kind of logic was not welcome in William Crenshaw's world. She continued cleaning, hoping that if she worked quickly and efficiently enough, his anger might subside before it escalated further. But today was different. Today, 7 years of accumulated rage and frustration had reached a critical mass in William Crenshaw's mind. As he watched Ruth on her hands and knees cleaning up the mess he had created, something crystallized in his thoughts. This was her fault. All of it. The failed crops, the isolation, the constant reminder of his inadequacy. She was the source of his problems, and it was time she understood exactly how much trouble she had caused. "Stand up," he ordered. Ruth rose slowly, still holding pieces of broken plate in her cupped hands. "Put that down and follow me." Ruth deposited the ceramic fragments on the kitchen table and followed Crenshaw as he walked toward the back door. Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. When he led her outside, it usually meant a punishment severe enough that he didn't want it witnessed from within the house. The October morning was crisp, with a heavy dew that soaked through Ruth's thin cotton dress as they walked across the yard. Crenshaw was heading toward the largest barn, a structure that housed equipment and stored the year's tobacco crop. Ruth had spent countless hours in that barn over the years, organizing tools, sweeping floors, and helping with harvest preparations. The barn was dim inside, lit only by morning sunlight filtering through gaps between the wooden planks. The air was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of drying tobacco leaves and the metallic scent of farm tools. Crenshaw walked directly to the center of the space, where a complex system of pulleys and ropes was used to lift heavy tobacco bales to the loft above. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, turning to face Ruth. His voice echoed slightly in the enclosed space. "You think I don't see the way you look at me, the way you judge me?" Ruth kept her head down, saying nothing. There was no safe response to accusations like these. 7 years I've fed you, clothed you, given you a place to live, and how do you repay me? With disrespect, with incompetence, with that look in your eyes like you think you're better than me. Crenshaw began pacing in a small circle around Ruth, his boots loud against the dirt floor of the barn. "Maybe it's time you learned some humility. Maybe it's time you understood exactly how much your comfort depends on my generosity." He grabbed a length of rope from the pulley system, testing its strength with a sharp tug. Ruth's eyes followed the movement, and for the first time that morning, real fear began to cut through her carefully maintained composure. "String you up for a few hours," Crenshaw continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone he used when planning particularly cruel punishments. "Let you think about how grateful you should be for everything I've given you." Something snapped in Ruth's mind at those words. 7 years of beatings, 7 years of humiliation, 7 years of being told she should be grateful for the privilege of being tortured. The anger that she had kept buried, controlled, carefully hidden, suddenly roared to the surface with a force that surprised even her. "Grateful?" The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. Crenshaw froze, the rope still in his hands. "What did you say?" Ruth raised her head and looked directly into his eyes for the first time in months. "I said grateful." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Ruth could hear her own heartbeat, could smell the sweat and tobacco and anger radiating from Crenshaw's body. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and they both knew it. Crenshaw's face darkened with a rage beyond anything Ruth had seen before. He dropped the rope and took a step toward her, his hands curling into fists. "You ungrateful piece of—" Ruth moved faster than she had ever moved in her life. As Crenshaw lunged toward her, she sidestepped and pushed against his back with all her strength, sending him stumbling toward the wooden support beam that held up the barn's main cross structure. His shoulder struck the beam hard, and he spun around to face her again, but Ruth was already in motion. The wooden mallet used for repairs was leaning against the wall, heavy enough to drive stakes but not so large that she couldn't lift it. Ruth grabbed it and swung it toward the rope mechanism that controlled the heavy crossbeam overhead. The first blow loosened the knot that held the entire system in place. The second blow sent it cascading down. Crenshaw realized what was happening just in time to raise his arms protectively over his head. The massive wooden beam, easily weighing 300 pounds, crashed down at an angle, missing his head but catching his legs just below the knees. The sound was unlike anything Ruth had ever heard. A combination of splintering wood, crushing bone, and William Crenshaw's agonized scream that seemed to go on forever. When the dust settled and the echoes faded, William Crenshaw lay pinned beneath the fallen beam, his legs twisted at angles that made Ruth's stomach turn. But he was conscious, his grey eyes wide with shock and pain as he stared up at her. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please, help me." Ruth stood perfectly still for a long moment, the mallet still in her hands, looking down at the man who had tormented her for 7 years. Something had fundamentally changed in that instant, when the beam fell. The balance of power that had defined every moment of her adult life had completely reversed. "Help me," Crenshaw repeated louder this time, panic creeping into his voice as he tried unsuccessfully to move the beam off his legs. Ruth set down the mallet carefully and walked closer to where he lay. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. "You want me to help you?" "Yes, please. We can work something out. I can change. I promise I can change." Ruth knelt down beside him, close enough that he could see her face clearly. For the first time in 7 years, William Crenshaw was looking at her as if she were a human being whose opinion mattered. "I don't think I will," she said quietly. The look of desperate hope in Crenshaw's eyes slowly transformed into something else. Understanding, fear, the realization that his fate was now entirely in the hands of someone who had every reason in the world to want him dead. And that's when Ruth Coleman's real revenge began. What happened next in that barn would haunt the few people who eventually learned the truth for the rest of their lives. But to understand the magnitude of what Ruth did, you need to understand what those 7 years of abuse had taught her about human suffering and how to inflict it with surgical precision. William Crenshaw had been an expert in psychological torture, and Ruth had been his unwilling student. She had learned that physical pain was temporary, but the right combination of hope and despair could break a person's spirit completely. She had learned that anticipation was often worse than the actual blow. She had learned that small kindnesses, strategically placed, could make subsequent cruelties exponentially more devastating. Now, with Crenshaw pinned helplessly beneath the beam, Ruth found herself in possession of knowledge she had never wanted, but would use with methodical precision. "My legs," Crenshaw gasped, his breathing becoming more labored as shock began to set in. "I can't feel my legs." Ruth examined the situation with the same careful attention she had once devoted to preparing his meals exactly to his specifications. The beam had crushed both of his legs below the knees, but the weight was distributed in such a way that while the bones were certainly broken, he was not in immediate danger of bleeding to death. The beam itself was wedged against other structural elements of the barn, making it impossible for him to shift it through his own efforts. "They're broken," she said matter-of-factly. "Both of them. Multiple fractures, I would guess. You have to get help. Get Moses, get the others. They can lift this thing off me." Ruth stood up and walked slowly around the fallen beam, examining it from different angles like a craftsman considering a complex project. Moses is in the far fields today. He won't be back until evening. The others are with him. Then go get Dr. Harrison from town. He'll know what to do. It's almost 15 miles round trip, Ruth said, continuing her slow circuit around the beam. On foot, that would take me most of the day. Take the horse. Take anything you need. Just go get help. Ruth stopped walking and looked down at him again. You know, in 7 years, you've never once said please to me when you weren't in pain. It's interesting how quickly that changes when circumstances shift. Crenshaw's face was pale now, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Ruth, please. Whatever you think I've done. Whatever I think you've done. Ruth's voice remained calm, but there was something underneath it now that made Crenshaw stop talking. Let me tell you what I think you've done, Master Crenshaw. I think you've broken 3 of my ribs. I think you've dislocated my shoulder twice. I think you've given me more bruises than I could count in 7 lifetimes. She began walking again, but this time she was examining the barn itself, looking at the various tools and equipment scattered around the space. I think you've called me stupid approximately 2,000 times. I think you've made me clean up messes you created just to watch me on my hands and knees. I think you've destroyed food I spent hours preparing because you enjoyed watching me realize that nothing I could do would ever be good enough for you. Ruth picked up a small crowbar from a nearby workbench, weighing it in her hands. But mostly I think you've made me believe that I deserved all of it. That somehow I had earned every cruel word and every blow because I wasn't worthy of basic human decency. I was wrong, Crenshaw said quickly, his eyes following the crowbar in her hands. I know I was wrong. I can make it right. I can give you your freedom. I can give you money, land, whatever you want. Ruth laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. My freedom? You think freedom is something you can give me? You think it's yours to give? She knelt down beside the beam, close enough to Crenshaw that he could smell the fear sweat that had begun to soak through her dress. I want to tell you a story, Master Crenshaw, about a little girl who used to believe that if she was good enough, smart enough, helpful enough, maybe the man who owned her would treat her with kindness. Do you want to hear about that little girl? Crenshaw tried to nod, though the movement seemed to cause him pain. That little girl tried so hard. Ruth continued, her voice taking on an almost sing-song quality. She learned to read, thinking that would make her useful. She learned to cook, to clean, to manage a household better than most free women. She never talked back, never complained, never asked for anything beyond the basic necessities of survival. Ruth positioned the crowbar against a section of debris near Crenshaw's left leg, not the beam itself, but smaller pieces of wood and metal that had fallen when the main structure collapsed. And do you know what happened to that little girl, Master Crenshaw? Ruth, please. She learned that none of it mattered. She learned that to some people, her very existence was an offense worthy of punishment. She learned that her intelligence was threatening. Her competence was embarrassing, and her hope was something to be systematically destroyed. Ruth began using the crowbar to move the debris, but instead of clearing a path that might help free Crenshaw, she was methodically making his situation worse. Each piece of wood and metal she pried loose was repositioned to add weight and pressure to different parts of his trapped legs. So that little girl died. Ruth continued conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather. She died slowly, over 7 years, until all that was left was someone who understood exactly how much pain one person could inflict on another. Crenshaw's breathing was becoming more ragged as the additional weight began to take effect. The pain was clearly intensifying, but Ruth's repositioning had been careful enough that there was no immediate danger of severing any major blood vessels. The thing is, Ruth said, sitting back on her heels and examining her work, I learned from the best. I learned from someone who understood that the anticipation of pain is often worse than pain itself. Someone who knew that hope, properly managed, could be turned into a weapon. She stood up again and walked to another part of the barn, this time returning with a small wooden bucket and a ladle. I'm going to get you some water, she announced. Because you're going to be here for a while, and I wouldn't want you to die of thirst before we're finished. Finished with what? Ruth dipped the ladle into the bucket and brought it to Crenshaw's lips, allowing him to drink deeply. The water was cool and clean, and for a moment, genuine gratitude flickered in his eyes. Finished with your education, she said, taking the ladle away. You see, for 7 years, you've been teaching me about power, about what happens when one person has complete control over another person's life. I was an excellent student, Master Crenshaw, probably the best student you ever had. She moved the bucket just out of his reach, but close enough that he could see it clearly. Now it's time for your final examination. See, just when we thought we'd seen the full scope of Ruth's transformation from victim to executioner, the true horror of her plan began to unfold. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support content like this. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories that reveal the hidden darkness in America's past. Let's discover together what Ruth had planned for the man who had tormented her for 7 long years. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, sending shafts of light through the gaps in the barn walls and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air around Ruth and her trapped tormentor. What happened next would later be described in sealed court documents as a systematic demonstration of calculated cruelty unprecedented in the annals of this jurisdiction. Ruth had positioned herself on a small wooden stool about 6 feet from where Crenshaw lay pinned beneath the beam. From this vantage point she could see his face clearly, could monitor his condition, and could maintain what she clearly considered to be a safe distance from any desperate attempts he might make to grab her. I've been thinking about this moment for a very long time, she said, her voice carrying the same conversational tone she had used when discussing household matters. Not this exact situation, of course. I never imagined I'd have you completely helpless like this. But I've thought about what I would say to you if I ever had the chance to speak honestly. Crenshaw tried to shift his position, wincing as the movement caused fresh waves of pain to shoot through his crushed legs. Ruth, you have to understand. I never meant... Shh. Ruth held up one finger in a gesture that was almost gentle. It's my turn to talk now. You've had 7 years to say whatever you wanted to say. I've had 7 years to listen. Today we're going to reverse those roles. She reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small piece of folded paper. Do you know what this is? Crenshaw squinted at the paper, trying to focus through the pain and shock. No. This is a list, Ruth said, carefully unfolding the document. I started writing it 3 years ago, when I realized that my memory wasn't good enough to keep track of everything. Every time you hurt me, I wrote it down. Every cruel word, every blow, every humiliation. I kept a record. The paper was covered with small, neat handwriting in faded ink. Ruth had clearly been working on this document for years, adding entries with methodical precision. Shall I read you some of the entries? Without waiting for an answer, Ruth cleared her throat and began to read in the same tone she might have used for a grocery list. January 15th, 1839. Twisted my left arm behind my back until my shoulder popped for dropping a spoon during breakfast preparation, called me clumsy and said clumsiness deserved punishment. She looked up at Crenshaw, whose face had grown even paler. January 22nd, 1839. Kicked me in the lower back for walking too slowly while carrying firewood. Told me that slow workers were lazy workers and lazy workers were thieves stealing time. Ruth continued reading, her voice never changing inflection, cataloging years of systematic abuse with the same attention to detail she had once brought to managing his household accounts. March 3rd, 1840. Slapped me across the face for crying when I learned my mother was sick. Said that tears were selfish because they made other people uncomfortable. With each entry she read, Ruth would pause and look at Crenshaw, watching his reactions. She seemed particularly interested in the moments when recognition flickered in his eyes, when he remembered the specific incident she was describing. August 12th, 1840. Made me stand outside in the rain for 2 hours after I asked if I could visit my mother before she died. Said that asking for privileges showed ingratitude for what I already had. The list went on and on. Dozens of entries, hundreds of small cruelties and large ones, each recorded with the same clinical precision. Ruth had been keeping a ledger of suffering, and now it was time to balance the accounts. "Do you remember that one?" she asked, folding the paper and returning it to her pocket. "When you made me stand in the rain while my mother was dying?" Crenshaw's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, she died that night, while I was standing in your yard, soaking wet, learning about gratitude. She died calling my name, and I wasn't there because you thought I needed to understand my place." Ruth stood up from the stool and walked over to a corner of the barn, where several farm tools were hanging from hooks on the wall. She selected a pair of long-handled pliers and examined them thoughtfully. "That was the night I started keeping the list," she continued, "because I realized that someday, somehow, there would have to be an accounting. Not justice from courts or laws or other white men who think like you think. Real justice, personal justice." She returned to her position near Crenshaw, the pliers held loosely in her right hand. "Now, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to work on getting you free from under that beam. Slowly, carefully. And while I work, you're going to apologize for every single thing on my list. Every entry gets an apology, a real one, where you admit what you did and why it was wrong." Hope flickered in Crenshaw's eyes. Yes, of course. I'll apologize for everything. I'm sorry, Ruth. I'm truly sorry for all of it." Ruth smiled, and the expression was somehow more terrifying than her anger had been. "Oh, that's not how this works," she said softly. "See, I learned from you that apologies given under duress aren't really apologies at all. They're just words people say to make pain stop. You taught me that lesson when you used to make me apologize for things that weren't my fault." She began using the pliers to grip small pieces of debris near Crenshaw's legs, but instead of removing them, she was adjusting their positions, increasing pressure in some areas while providing minimal relief in others. "No, your apologies have to be earned. For each entry on my list, you have to experience something equivalent to what you put me through. That's only fair, don't you think?" Crenshaw's eyes widened as he began to understand what Ruth had planned. "You can't. Ruth, you can't do this. This isn't you. This isn't who you are." "You're right," Ruth agreed pleasantly. "This isn't who I was. But you spent 7 years teaching me to be someone else. You spent 7 years showing me exactly how much cruelty one person could inflict on another. Did you think I wasn't paying attention?" She adjusted her grip on the pliers and applied pressure to a sharp piece of metal that was pressing against Crenshaw's right leg. Not enough to cause serious damage, but enough to send fresh waves of agony through his already traumatized nervous system. "Let's start with entry number 1, Ruth said, returning to her stool and opening the folded paper again. January 15th, 1839, the dropped spoon incident. The torture that followed was methodical, creative, and designed with an intimate understanding of human psychology that could only have come from someone who had been systematically brutalized for years. Ruth had learned not just about physical pain, but about the particular cruelty of hope repeatedly offered and withdrawn, of dignity systematically stripped away, of the psychological warfare that can break a person more completely than any physical assault. For each entry on her list, Ruth developed what she called a corresponding lesson. The man who had twisted her arm until her shoulder dislocated found his own arm pinned beneath debris at an angle that created a constant, agonizing pressure. The man who had kicked her in the back for moving too slowly discovered what it felt like to be completely unable to move while desperately needing to escape his situation. But Ruth's most diabolical innovation was her use of water. Every 30 minutes, like clockwork, she would bring the ladle to Crenshaw's lips and allow him to drink. The water was always cool, always clean, always exactly what his body desperately needed. And each time as he drank gratefully, she would tell him that his cooperation was earning him this kindness. "You see how much better things can be when we treat each other with respect," she would say, her voice gentle and caring. "This is what kindness looks like, Master Crenshaw. This is how people should behave toward one another." Then she would return to her systematic infliction of pain, and Crenshaw would realize that the water had not been kindness at all, but merely another form of psychological torture designed to make the subsequent cruelty more devastating. As the hours passed, Ruth worked her way through the list with methodical precision. Each entry was read aloud, each corresponding lesson was applied, and each extracted apology was evaluated for sincerity. Apologies that Ruth deemed insufficient meant that particular lesson would be repeated until Crenshaw could demonstrate proper remorse. "I don't think you really understand why it was wrong to make me stand in the rain while my mother died," Ruth would say, after an apology that lacked sufficient detail or emotion. "Let me help you think about it more clearly." She had discovered that Crenshaw was terrified of insects, a phobia he had managed to hide during their years together. The barn was full of spiders, beetles, and other creatures that could be encouraged to explore areas near his face and hands. Ruth used this knowledge with surgical precision, never allowing actual harm but creating a constant state of panic and revulsion. "My mother was afraid too," Ruth would whisper as she guided a particularly large spider across Crenshaw's forehead. "She was afraid of dying alone, afraid that I had forgotten about her, afraid that her life hadn't mattered to anyone. Can you imagine what that fear felt like?" By midday, Crenshaw had begun to break down completely. The physical pain, the psychological torture, and the systematic destruction of his hope had combined to reduce him to a creature of pure desperation. He begged, he pleaded, he promised things he had no power to deliver, but Ruth had learned from a master that desperation made people say anything, and that promises extracted under duress were worthless. "Please," he sobbed, his voice hoarse from hours of screaming and pleading. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll free you. I'll free everyone. I'll give you money. I'll help you go north. I'll never hurt anyone again. Just please make this stop." Ruth paused in her work and looked at him with what might have been pity in someone else, but in her eyes was something much colder. "Do you know what you sound like?" she asked. "You sound exactly like me 7 years ago when I was begging you to stop hurting me. Do you remember what you told me then?" Crenshaw's eyes were wide with terror and pain, but she could see that he remembered. "You told me that begging was undignified. You told me that accepting my situation with grace would serve me better than pleading for mercy I hadn't earned. You told me that pain was a teacher, and that I should be grateful for the lessons it taught me." Ruth stood up and smoothed down her dress, a gesture so normal and domestic that it seemed obscene in the context of what she was doing. "So I'm going to give you the same advice you gave me. Accept your situation with grace, Master Crenshaw. Be grateful for the lessons you're learning, and stop begging because it's undignified." The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows through the barn. Ruth had been working for over 8 hours, and she was only halfway through her list, but she showed no signs of fatigue or diminishing resolve. If anything, she seemed energized by the work, as if each extracted apology and each moment of Crenshaw's suffering was feeding something in her that had been starved for 7 years. "We're making good progress," she announced, consulting her list. "Only 43 more entries to go. We should be finished well before midnight." Crenshaw had stopped responding coherently hours ago. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body going into shock from the combination of physical trauma and psychological torture. But Ruth had learned to recognize the signs, and whenever he seemed to be slipping away from awareness, she would apply just enough stimulus to bring him back. "Stay with me," she would say, her voice taking on the same tone she had once used when caring for him during brief illnesses. "We're not finished yet. You can't leave until we've completed your education." But something was changing in Ruth as well. The systematic infliction of suffering was awakening parts of her personality that had been dormant, or perhaps had never existed before this day. She found herself studying Crenshaw's reactions with scientific curiosity, making mental notes about which techniques were most effective, which combinations of physical and psychological pressure produced the most interesting results. "You know," she said during one of her periodic water breaks, I never understood before why you seemed to enjoy hurting me so much. I always thought it was just anger or frustration or some kind of sickness. But it's not, is it? She knelt down beside Crenshaw's head, close enough that he could smell the sweat and determination on her skin. It's about control. It's about the moment when someone realizes that their entire existence depends on your whim. It's about watching them understand that nothing they can say or do will change their situation unless you decide to change it. Ruth's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if she were discovering truths about herself that surprised her. I think I'm beginning to understand why you kept me alive all these years. You could have killed me, or sold me, or simply worked me to death like you did some of the others. But you kept me close because I was the perfect victim. Smart enough to understand what was happening, strong enough to survive it, but powerless to stop it. She laughed softly, a sound that held no warmth but contained something that might have been wonder. The thing is, Master Crenshaw, you created something you never intended to create. You took a frightened girl and turned her into someone who understands cruelty better than you ever did. You taught me lessons about power and pain and human nature that I never wanted to learn. Ruth stood up and walked to the barn's main door, looking out at the fields where the other enslaved workers were still laboring, unaware of what was happening in the barn. They would return at sunset, as they always did, expecting to find their master in the main house and Ruth preparing the evening meal. "They won't come looking for you," she said, turning back to Crenshaw. "Moses knows better than to disturb you when you're disciplining me. They've learned to stay away when they hear screaming from the barn." The truth of this statement hit Crenshaw with fresh horror. For years, his systematic abuse of Ruth had been an open secret among the enslaved population. They had all known what was happening, and they had all learned to make themselves scarce when it occurred. His isolation was complete. "So we have all the time we need," Ruth continued. "No interruptions, no rescue, no one coming to check on you until I decide it's time for them to find you." She returned to her position on the stool and consulted her list again. "Now, where were we? Yes, August 30th, 1840, you made me burn my own letters." The letters had been Ruth's most precious possessions, the only connection she had maintained to the fragments of her humanity that Crenshaw hadn't yet destroyed. They were letters she had written to her mother during the months of her final illness, letters that would never be sent, but that had provided Ruth with a way to express feelings she was forbidden to voice aloud. In those letters, Ruth had poured out her fears, her dreams, her desperate hope that somehow things might change. She had written about memories of her childhood, about the songs her mother used to sing, about the small kindnesses that had sustained her through the darkest periods of her enslavement. The letters had been hidden in a loose board beneath her sleeping pallet, a secret that she thought was safe. But William Crenshaw had discovered them during one of his periodic searches of the slave quarters, and what he found in those pages had enraged him beyond measure. Not because of anything treasonous or dangerous, but because they revealed the depth of Ruth's inner life, the complexity of her thoughts and emotions, the undeniable evidence of her humanity. On that August morning in 1840, he had forced Ruth to build a fire in the yard behind the main house. Then, one by one, he had made her feed her letters to the flames while he read selected passages aloud in a mocking voice. "My dearest Mama," he had recited in a high-pitched parody of Ruth's voice, "I dreamed last night that we were walking together through the fields behind our old cabin, and you were teaching me the names of the wildflowers like you used to do when I was small." He had laughed as the paper caught fire and curled into ash. How touching, how absolutely precious. The slave girl thinks she's a poet. Each letter had taken several minutes to burn completely, and Crenshaw had made sure that Ruth watched every second of their destruction. Months of her thoughts, her memories, her private conversations with the ghost of her dying mother, all reduced to smoke and ash while he provided commentary on the foolishness of slaves who thought they had the right to private thoughts. "You want to know what your biggest mistake was?" Crenshaw had said as the last letter crumbled into nothing. "You forgot your place. You started thinking of yourself as a person instead of property. These letters prove it. All this self-indulgent emotional nonsense, it's not natural for someone like you. Now, 7 years later, Ruth looked down at her tormentor and smiled. Do you remember what you said when you made me burn my letters? Crenshaw's voice was barely audible. Please, no more. You said that the problem with people like me was that we forgot our place. You said we needed constant reminders of what we were and what we weren't. Ruth reached into her pocket and withdrew a small bundle of papers. But you see, I never stopped writing letters. I just got better at hiding them. The papers she held were covered with the same neat handwriting that had filled her list of grievances, but these pages contained something else entirely. These were letters addressed to William Crenshaw. Letters she had written over the past 3 years as her hatred had crystallized into something resembling a plan. I want to read you one of them, Ruth said, unfolding the topmost sheet. This one is dated just last week. She cleared her throat and began to read in the same conversational tone she had used for everything else that day. Dear Master Crenshaw, today you kicked me for spilling flour while making your bread. As I cleaned up the mess, I imagined what it would feel like to have you helpless beneath me, begging for mercy that I could choose to give or withhold. I imagined the look in your eyes when you finally understood that your life depended entirely on my whim. Ruth looked up from the letter and met Crenshaw's horrified gaze. I imagined making you apologize for every cruel word, every blow, every moment of suffering you've caused me. I imagined taking my time with it, making sure you experienced every emotion you've put me through. Fear, desperation, humiliation, pain, and above all, the terrible knowledge that nothing you could say or do would change your situation unless I decided to let it change. She folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket. The thing is, Master Crenshaw, when I wrote that letter, it was just a fantasy, just a way to keep myself sane during another day of your cruelty. I never really believed I would have the chance to make it real. Ruth stood up and walked to where she had left the crowbar hours earlier. When she picked it up, her hands were steady. But here we are, and I find that reality is so much more satisfying than fantasy ever was. The final phase of Ruth's revenge was the most methodical yet. She began to systematically remove the debris that she had spent hours carefully positioning around Crenshaw's legs. But instead of freeing him, each piece she moved created new pressure points, new sources of agony, as the weight of the beam shifted and settled into different configurations. You taught me that hope was the cruelest torture of all, she said as she worked. Every time you would hint that my situation might improve, only to make it worse instead. Every time you would dangle the possibility of mercy just out of reach. With each adjustment Ruth made, Crenshaw would feel a moment of relief as pressure lifted from one area, followed immediately by intensified pain as it was redirected somewhere else. She was conducting a symphony of suffering, orchestrating each note with the skill of someone who had been forced to become an expert on the subject. So, I'm going to give you hope too, Ruth continued. I'm going to make you believe just for a moment that I'm actually going to let you live. That may be, if you apologize sincerely enough, if you promise convincingly enough, if you debase yourself completely enough, I might spare your life. She paused in her work and looked down at him with something that might have been affection in a different context. Because that moment when hope dies is the most exquisite pain of all. And you deserve to experience it the way I experienced it every single day for 7 years. As the afternoon wore on toward evening, Ruth worked with increasing efficiency. She had found her rhythm, her technique perfected through hours of practice. Crenshaw's responses had become more predictable, his capacity for surprise nearly exhausted. He begged when she expected him to beg, screamed when she applied pressure, wept when she offered false comfort. But Ruth was changing too. The shy, frightened girl who had entered the barn that morning was gone completely, replaced by someone who moved with purposeful confidence, who spoke with authority, who controlled every aspect of the situation with masterful precision. She had discovered capabilities within herself that she never knew existed, and the discovery was intoxicating. "I want you to understand something," she said as the sun began to set outside the barn. "Everything that's happened to you today is exactly what you chose for yourself 7 years ago. Every moment of pain, every instant of terror, every second of desperation, you created it all when you decided that someone like me didn't deserve to be treated as a human being." Ruth had worked her way through almost her entire list now. Dozens of apologies had been extracted, each one more desperate than the last. Crenshaw had broken down completely hours ago, reduced to a creature of pure animal terror who would say anything, promise anything, admit to anything if it might make the pain stop. "This isn't justice," he whispered through lips that were cracked and bleeding. "This is murder." "No," Ruth replied calmly. "Justice would have been a quick death. Justice would have been you standing trial for your crimes. This isn't justice at all." She knelt down beside him one final time, close enough that he could see the expression in her eyes clearly. "This is education. I'm teaching you what it feels like to be completely powerless. I'm showing you what 7 years of systematic cruelty does to a person's soul. I'm giving you the same lesson you gave me, the one about what happens when someone forgets their place in the world." Ruth reached into her pocket and withdrew the original list, now stained with sweat and dirt from the day's activities. "One last entry," she announced. "October 15th, 1841. William Crenshaw learned what it means to be at the mercy of someone who has no mercy left to give." She carefully wrote the words on the bottom of the page, her handwriting as neat and precise as it had been for every other entry over the past 3 years. "There," she said, folding the paper for the final time. "Now we're finished. What happened in the final hour of William Crenshaw's life would never be fully documented in any official record, though fragments of the story would surface decades later in testimonies that were quickly sealed and forgotten. According to the few accounts that survived, Ruth Coleman spent those last 60 minutes not inflicting new tortures, but talking. She told Crenshaw about the girl she had been before he destroyed her, about the dreams she had cherished, and the future she had imagined for herself. She described the moment when she had realized that her humanity meant nothing to him, that she would never be anything more than property to be used and discarded at his whim. She explained how that realization had hollowed her out inside, leaving room for something else to grow in the empty spaces. "You created me," she said as darkness began to fall outside the barn. "The person I am now, the person who could do what I've done today, she's your creation as much as mine, much as you took a frightened girl and molded her into someone capable of this level of calculated cruelty. You should be proud. It's probably the most successful project you ever completed." As Crenshaw's breathing became more labored and his periods of consciousness grew shorter, Ruth made her final adjustments to the debris around his legs. The weight distribution that had kept him alive throughout the day was carefully altered, allowing the full pressure of the beam to settle onto his chest and abdomen. "I want you to know that I forgive you," she said as his eyes began to glaze over. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying hatred for 7 years has been exhausting, and I'm ready to put it down." William Crenshaw died at approximately 9:30 that evening, just as Moses and the other field workers were returning from their day's labor. Ruth met them at the barn door, her face calm and her hands folded peacefully in front of her. "There's been an accident," she announced. "Master Crenshaw was working in the barn when one of the support beams fell. I tried to help him, but the beam was too heavy for me to move alone." Moses, who had survived 30 years of slavery by understanding exactly when not to ask questions, simply nodded and began organizing the others to clear the debris. They worked in silence, and when they finally uncovered Crenshaw's body, no one remarked on the fact that he appeared to have been dead for only a few minutes, despite Ruth's claim that the accident had occurred that morning. The official investigation was perfunctory. A white man had died in an accident on his own property, with his slave claiming to have witnessed the event. The physical evidence supported the story, and there was no reason to suspect foul play. William Crenshaw was buried 3 days later in the family cemetery, with Ruth Coleman among the mourners who stood quietly at the graveside. The Crenshaw property was sold at auction 6 weeks after the funeral. Ruth, along with the other enslaved individuals, was purchased by a neighboring farmer named Thomas Garrett, whose reputation for fair treatment made him wealthy in a region where cruelty was more common than kindness. Under Garrett's ownership, Ruth resumed her life as a domestic worker, performing her duties with the same efficiency and attention to detail that had characterized her work under Crenshaw. But those who knew her well noticed changes. Ruth smiled more readily than she had in years, spoke with greater confidence, and carried herself with a dignity that seemed unshakable. She never mentioned the events of October 15, 1841, and no one ever asked her about them directly. The truth about what happened in that barn remained buried until 1923, when renovations to the old Rutherford County Courthouse uncovered a collection of sealed documents that had been hidden behind a false wall in the basement. Among these papers was a detailed confession written in Ruth Coleman's distinctive handwriting, along with the complete list of grievances she had maintained for 7 years. The confession described every detail of Crenshaw's death with clinical precision, explaining Ruth's methods, her motivations, and her complete lack of remorse for what she had done. The document concluded with a paragraph that legal scholars would later describe as one of the most chilling statements ever recorded in American legal history. I write this account not as a confession of guilt, but as a record of justice finally served. William Crenshaw spent 7 years teaching me that some people are born to suffer, while others are born to inflict suffering. Today I proved him wrong. Today I showed him that the roles can be reversed, that the teacher can become the student, that the master can become the slave. I regret nothing that happened in that barn, because for the first time in 7 years, the world was exactly as fair as it should be. The documents were quickly resealed and returned to storage, deemed too inflammatory for public disclosure. They remained hidden for another 40 years, until a fire destroyed the courthouse basement in 1963. Taking Ruth Coleman's confession with it. But the story survived in whispered conversations and family legends, passed down through generations of descendants who had known the truth all along. In some versions, Ruth became a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against oppression. In others, she was portrayed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pushing human beings beyond their breaking point. What remained consistent in every telling was the central truth that Ruth herself had understood that October morning when she picked up the mallet and brought down the beam that would define the rest of her life. Some lessons can only be taught through experience, and some teachers must become students before they can truly understand what they have been teaching. Ruth Coleman lived for another 37 years after William Crenshaw's death, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1878 at the age of 61. She never married, never had children, and never spoke publicly about the events of 1841. But those who knew her in her later years described her as a woman of remarkable inner peace, someone who had settled all her accounts with the world and found a way to live with the choices she had made. Her gravestone in the Garrett family cemetery bears only her name and dates. But local legend claims that on certain October mornings, when the light falls just right through the autumn mist, visitors can see additional words carved into the stone. Words that supposedly read, "She remembered everything, and she settled every debt." Whether such an inscription ever existed is a matter of debate among historians and folklore enthusiasts. What is certain is that Ruth Coleman's story represents one of the most disturbing examples of how systematic cruelty can transform victims into something their oppressors never intended to create. This mystery shows us that the line between victim and victimizer is often thinner than we like to believe, and that justice, when denied by law and society, will sometimes find its own terrible way into the world. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Ruth was justified in her actions, or did she become the very thing she fought against? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts with others who are trying to understand this dark chapter of American history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories that reveal the hidden darkness in our nation's past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates the complex moral questions that history forces us to confront. Until next time, remember that the past is never as simple as we want it to be, and the truth is often more disturbing than any fiction we could imagine.